should we introduce ourselves?
Sure.
Yes. Let's do that.
Okay.
Because I feel like, I don't know, I'm in charge of the structure here and it could go sideways.
Okay.
Yeah, you introduce yourself.
All right. I'm Angie Thomas, the author of The Hate You Give and the upcoming book On the Come Up.
And my name's Reni Eddo-Lodge. I'm the author of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. No upcoming book as of yet, so don't ask me. Let's get right into it, okay? It's an honor to be discussing this with you. I came to one of your London events way back last year, like June or something, Waterstones Piccadilly, or the vibe was great.
Awesome.
The vibe was excellent. So I've got a list of questions here.
Okay, cool.
This is all very formal, but sometimes I don't trust myself to remember things sometimes. So we were just discussing more informally about what you do when, you know, white readers come up to you looking for an absolution of all of their perceived sins. Mm-hmm. And that links in quite nicely with my first question, which is the issue of white friends in The Hate You Give, and the idea of, you know, I'm sure you get a lot of people coming up to you and saying, oh, well, what should I do as a white person? I also get that. Those are also some of the questions that I received in order to ask you, which I'm not going to. But, you know, in The Hate You Give, there is, Starr is got very close bonds with two different white people, very different relationships. One of her closest friends, Hayley, and her boyfriend, Chris. How can I discuss this without spoiling it? I'm going to assume that people have read it at this point. But what's really interesting about those two, they both go to the white private school alongside her, and they have radically different ways of thinking and responding to issues to do with race and racism. So, you know, in response to that question, how can I be an ally? Did you write those characters as examples about how to be and how not to be an ally?
Oh yeah, absolutely. To me, it's interesting because when I think of Hayley and Chris does not think he's an ally enough, and he's a pretty good ally. I won't say he's there. I will be the first to say Chris is not, even at the end of the novel, Chris is not woke. He's still drowsy, you know, but he doesn't realize.
Hay fever tablets.
Yeah. Exactly. He doesn't think he's a good enough ally, but he's a pretty good ally. Hayley is the type of person who thinks she is a good ally, and she is not an ally at all. So through those two characters, I wanted to show how whiteness even approaches blackness sometimes. With Hayley, we have this young girl who has so much privilege, who doesn't recognize her privilege, and who doesn't realize how her privilege affects Starr, or even the role that she plays as a white person in this role. I mean, in this world that Starr is in, the role that she plays in setting up the standard. With Chris is this young man who comes to understand his privilege. He recognizes that as a young, white, rich male, he is one of the most privileged people in the world. And he comes to understand that a little more, and he comes to recognize that Starr does not have privilege, and he comes to not be colorblind. And that's a key thing. You know, so often people say, oh, I don't see color. There's nothing wrong with seeing color. It's what you do once you see color when the problems occur. So with Chris, Starr needs him to see color. She needs him to recognize that as a young black woman in America, there are certain obstacles she's going to face that he will never have to face, and she needs him to be prepared for it. So yeah, I'd like to say that Chris is definitely a good ally in the making. But what we need more than good allies, we actually need more co-conspirators. You know, we need more people on the front line, not just saying, oh, I support this. We need you actually out there doing the work. And I would like to think that Chris would become that person eventually. Absolutely. Hayley, I don't know. I know too many Hayleys in real life that I don't have a lot of hope.
So I think like there's this point in the book where Hayley unfollows Starr on Tumblr due to the picture that Starr put up of Emmett Till. And it really reminded me of, you know, a point, it's so weird because, you know, you write fiction, I write nonfiction, but I wrote about a time when, you know, while I was at university during a module and learning about the transatlantic slave trade, I had a white friend who was like, I don't think I need to learn about this, and left.
Wow.
Left the class. And I just thought like that parallel is really interesting. I'm assuming you've come across that attitude in your day-to-day life. That's sort of like, it's not really relevant to me, so I'm not going to stick around to learn about it.
Oh, absolutely. I would say that right now in the States specifically, our entire administration is made up of people who, unless it affects them, they don't care about it. Unless it affects people who are like them, they don't care about it. You know, and that's a sad way to be. So I look at books as being a great way to combat that. I often say if some of our current political leaders read books about black kids as kids, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. It would be understood. So there's always this issue of if it doesn't affect me, it doesn't concern me. And you know, that even goes beyond black and white. And I think another example in that in the book is when Starr realizes that Maya has dealt with racism too from Haley. And it's realizing that, wow, it's not just me. Even though that doesn't technically affect me, in a way it does. So I think we have to get to a place where more of us start realizing that when it affects those young people who are now being torn apart from their families due to border control and issues like that in the States, that should affect us all. It shouldn't just be to them. This is a societal issue. And so when I look at the book and I look at how Haley comes to look at the whole thing of this makes me uncomfortable, seeing this Emmett Till picture makes me uncomfortable, so I don't want to see it. But Starr's like, this is what I have to face in the world. These are the thoughts and the ideals that still affect me. I have no choice but to face it. If you're my friend, I need you to face it too. You can't turn away from it just because it doesn't affect you. So I hope that more young people more people when they read the book and they see Haley, it makes them realize that even if something makes you uncomfortable and even if it doesn't affect you, I still need you to recognize it, because that's the only way we're going to get rid of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was really sort of interesting towards the end of the book. You provided an answer to questions I'm sure you hear at Q&As, which is not just what can I do, but my friend is racist. How should I deal with them? I always say, don't be friends anymore, you know.
Exactly.
And I think that you dealt with that in a really very realistic way in the book, in terms of Starr just sort of saying, this is a friendship I can let go.
Yeah, I had to do that myself at times. And it's, you know, sometimes you're like, well, that person is nice, but, you know, and at what point does niceness outweigh racist? You know, what point does niceness outweigh racism? It shouldn't. You know, racism is one of these things that it affects us in more ways than one. And we can't, if we're saying I'm okay with this person even though they're nice, that's still like saying I'm okay with their racism. We can't do that. That's why we have some of the issues we have now. We've let people get away with it. We've accepted the other parts of them without addressing that part of them. So it's definitely, for me, it was something I had to learn and Starr has to learn. And now I've been told by a lot of young girls, specifically young black girls, that I've ended a lot of friendships because, but you know, part of me is like, good, you don't need to put yourself through that. If they're racist about other black people, trust me, they can be racist about you too. So you don't need that in your life. So I guess my apologies to all the friendships I ruined. I
think what the book does really well, because it is YA and it is aimed at younger readers, is models what clear communication looks like when you come to that point in a friendship. You know, it's not like Starr just ghosts. Like, they can, both Starr and Maya communicate with Haley repeatedly, look, this is unacceptable, you can't keep doing this to us, etc., etc. Giving Haley the chances to reflect on herself, on herself and her behaviour, and Haley chooses not to do that. And I think that's very important in those friendships, real world or fictional, when that conflict arises, particularly at this moment in time when we're having these conversations on a sort of public and global scale, to have that conversation.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We have to communicate more, and we have to call things out and call them what they are. You know, it's easy to avoid it. It would have been easy for Starr to just leave Haley alone and just stop talking to her and not tell her why. And then Haley would go on not realizing, not being called out and not getting checked on her racism. So it's definitely, it's uncomfortable. I say it's hardest to call out the people we love the most. But it's necessary. So I hope that by showing that Starr calling it out and Maya calling it out, it shows that you have to do that. You have to call out the people you care about in order to really either challenge them to change or just give you the a good reason to walk away.
Absolutely, and I'm an optimist. I believe that if Hayley really does care about Starr in the sequel, who knows, then Hayley will reflect on her behaviour and be like, I care about this person, I seem to have hurt them, I don't understand how or why, I'm going to go and think about it.
No sequel though.
No
sequel.
Or in the continuation of the story in my head.
I would like to think that it would take time, but I'd like to think that eventually Hayley would recognize her faults and where she messed up, and recognize too that Maya and Starr mean a lot to her. And if it means that the two people who she cares about that much are saying you've hurt us, maybe she needs to self-reflect. So I'd like to think she gets to that point. Hayley is very stubborn, I will say it, but I'd like to think she gets to that point.
Absolutely. I mean, that sort of whole Hayley dynamic reminds me of all these situations I went through that led me to write Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Because at some point you get fatigued. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that in previous interviews you sort of said that you chose to write YA, that's a young adult literature, if nobody knows, because so many of the names that the Black Lives Matter movement were organising around were young people. And that really, it got me there when you said that, because I was like, that's so true. We're talking about teenagers. Do you think that black children are denied the innocence that their white counterparts are afforded in the public eye?
Absolutely. Black children are always seen as being older than they actually are. They're always seen as being more mature than their white counterparts. They're never given the benefit of innocence. You you see like young black girls in the neighborhood I grew up in, a lot of people wouldn't call them innocent, but I do. So no, they never get the benefit. I look at Tamir Rice and that whole situation, and I think one of the officers actually said he thought it was an adult. How can you look at that 12-year-old boy with that baby face and think that was an adult? They're never given that benefit. Even when they're dead, they're not given that benefit. Trayvon Martin is called a thug more than he's ever called a young boy. So for me, writing for them means I want to show them their innocence and their awesome selves. I want to show a character like Starr, who, she's strong, but she's also vulnerable. She has good moments, but she also has weakness, and that's okay because that makes her human. And it's sad that I even have to say this, but young black kids are human. They're not super predators or anything like that. They're human beings and they're children still. So why can't we give them that benefit? And for me as a writer, that's like a big thing that I want to show, their innocence, even when they're dealing with hardships, how innocent they are.
Absolutely. It reminded me of here in the UK last year, there was a 20-year-old, his name was Rashan Charles, who died after police contact in East London. And the ways in which he's died is disputed, but we know that it was after he came in contact with a police officer. And the ways in which the press around monstered him, 20 years old, 2 decades on this earth, giving us a picture of him about, essentially saying that he deserved to die. And in the UK, we don't have the death penalty, so it's always outrageous. I'm not saying it's any more or less outrageous than the US, but I always say we do not have the death penalty in this country. So how is it that people are dying when they're coming into contact with law enforcement? And in the book with Starr, that's also something that she picks up on very quickly, that her friend Khalil is monstered in the press after he's killed by a cop.
Yeah. It goes back to even what I was saying about Trayvon Martin. He's often called a thug before a victim. Michael Brown is called a thug before a victim. Young black people are always blamed for their own deaths in these situations. And it's exhausting because you wonder, okay, at what point do we become victims? I look at Philando Castile. Philando did everything that we're told we're supposed to do, and yet and still he ended up dead. And yet and still there were people who blamed him for it. Why aren't we given that benefit of victimhood? What is it about black people that we don't get that benefit? So it's complicated as a young black person in America, especially to feel as if something happened to me, people would find a way to justify it. Because that's really what it comes down to. The reason they aren't victims is because someone's trying to justify why it happened. You don't call Michael Brown a victim because you're trying to justify what happened to him. And at what point do people stop trying to justify these deaths and people start trying to get justice for these deaths?
Absolutely. So in the book, Starr stays quiet for a good significant amount of the book. Why was that? Why did you write her as somebody who tried to get on with everyday lives after? Would you think it was her way of dealing with trauma? Oh, absolutely. And I also wanted to show someone who probably would handle it the way most people would handle it at first. It's easy to say, oh, if I was in that situation, I would speak up, speak out immediately. It's harder to be in that situation. A big inspiration for me when I was writing the book was Rachel Gentile, Trayvon Martin's best friend. And I remember when Rachel went to court to George Zimmerman's trial, and she got up there on the stand and she spoke up for Trayvon, more people criticized the way she said things as opposed to what she was saying. And it was for young girls in my neighborhood, they saw themselves in Rachel, and it was like, well, what's the point of speaking up and speaking out when people are just going to criticize how I say it? And that's honestly, that's a valid feeling, and it's a valid fear. And I wanted to show young people who would identify with Starr, because I've had a lot of young kids say, I've seen things happen in my neighborhood and I'm scared to speak up on it. And that's valid, that's a real feeling, but I also wanted to show someone who comes to overcome that fear so that I could show my readers, no, it's not easy, but it's doable. And I think too, as a young Black person in America, you're often made to feel as if your voice doesn't matter. And that's where the silence will come from. But with Starr finding her voice eventually, I hope that it inspires them to find their voices eventually, but to also recognize that the fear is normal. I really like the relationship between Starr and her dad in that, like, from my reading, he really did want her to speak out, but he never ever put her under pressure. He was very light touch with it. Why did you write him like that? Maverick is probably my favorite character besides Starr, and I wanted to write this loving, gentle father because we don't get that a lot with Black men. You know, we don't see that a lot. There are plenty of Black men who are like that, but we don't see that a lot in media. And I didn't want him to come off as, you got to do this, you got to do that. I wanted him to be gentle with her and to be patient with her because that's what she needed right then. But I wanted to show that through a Black man. We don't see that a lot. When we see Black men a lot of times in media, they're shown as being automatically brute and just go for it and you got to do this, you got to speak it, blah, blah, blah. No, he wants to be patient. He's loving and kind about it, and he's patient with her, and he understands her fear because he has his own fears. And that's where his patience really comes from, his own fears. That's really why he doesn't push her. And I wanted to show that it's okay for a Black man to be afraid. It's okay to show for him to have his vulnerabilities as well, because that's his baby. And he knows her fears, but he has his own fears, and he feels as if his fears are valid too. He knows if she speaks up, it's going to put her in a position, an uncomfortable position for him. So he's like, when you're ready, I'll be ready. And I really wanted to show that through that character and recognize that this is a real thing in Black men, and I respect it and I honor it and I absolutely love it. Absolutely. I hope that more Black parents read the book, actually. I think that light touch is sometimes just saying, I think that light touch and allowing teenagers to come to their own conclusions. I think more Black parents could. Oh yeah, but you know, I think too for a lot of Black parents, there's a lot of fear. Yeah. You know, and that fear sometimes is translated into force. You know, it's translated into strictness. Sometimes it's translated into harshness. So with Maverick, I wanted to do it the other way. Yeah. He has his fears, but he's going to be patient and loving and kind about it and wait. So yeah, it's all Black parents. Just everyone's got a story though. So, sort of like carrying on with Starr's dad. So I think there was really interesting thing that you did in the book where instead of like religion or, you know, what is it that you have in the States when you pledge allegiance in the morning? Thank you, country. What's it called? The Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. I love it. I find it odd. Yeah. Well, you know,
we don't do that like in our homes,
Right.
but we do it like at like sometimes in schools or at games, the NFL. You know, but yeah, it's an interesting thing.
It is very interesting. State sanctioned enforced patriotism.
Yes, that's basically yes.
Well, in the book, there's none of that in Starr's family life, but instead she knows the Black Panthers 10-point program off by heart. I'm assuming that's not something that kids have to recite in US schools in the same way the Pledge of Allegiance is. So, like, I wondered why that method of, you know, remembrance and like, you know, remembering, you know, Black radical activism was so important in the book.
It was definitely important. For me, it's a thing of ownership, and it's a way to combat revisionist history. When I was growing up, the only civil rights leaders we really knew about in school were Martin Luther King and a little bit of Malcolm X, but we didn't get the real Malcolm X. We got the sanitized Malcolm X. We didn't get the real Dr. King. We got the sanitized Dr. King. And they never talked about the Black Panthers. And then when you do research on the Black Panthers, a lot of times they're made to look like the villain in the story. You hear all the negative stuff, but here's the thing. We have the free breakfast in schools in the States because the Panthers started that. They did that first. There's so many positive things that they did that no one talks about. So with Maverick, I know for me, Maverick is, and it's showing my fangirl colors, but Maverick is what Tupac probably would have been as a dad. And I would like to think he would have instilled that in his kids too, because he would want them to know more beyond what's taught in their history books. He wanted them to know that there was this group of people, the Black Panthers, who were determined to change things, and they came up with their own Bill of Rights. And for communities like ours, I want you to know this so that you know a little bit more about who you are. And I think that's important. I think it's important for our kids to know history beyond what's taught in history books. And that's really where that comes from.
So I've been listening to a lot of Tupac actually since reading the book, because I haven't listened to him for years. And I was like, oh, I have to go and download the greatest hits. And so I was listening to Changes, which I think I first heard as a teenager. And I think now listening back to it, that song as a sort of like politically educated adult, I'm like, wow. Yeah. He really was providing some context. Yeah. And I realised that that's also something that you're doing in this book. You know, with both that song and this book, it's speaking about the contradictions and complexities of situations that African American people in particular find themselves in that are so often like cleaved into wholly good or wholly bad. You know, there's this line in the song about, my stomach's hurting, so I have to go and snatch a bag to eat and something like that. And, you know, in the book, you also speak to many complexities, and as the book continues, this is for context, obviously, I'm not explaining to you your own book, but we learn more about the situation that Khalil was in when he died, and how he wasn't on his way to science club. You know? Can you speak a little bit more about why he decided to speak about the complexities and contradictions, particularly with his life?
With Khalil, Khalil is based on so many young men that I know, either when I was growing up or I know now in my neighborhood. And when you first look at them, when a lot of people first look at them, they make generalizations about them. Oh, with his sagging pants, that's nothing but a thug. Oh, he's selling drugs, he's not bound for anything, he's just doing that. But nobody explores the why. Nobody talks about the why. And with Khalil, I wanted to talk about the why. Why does a young man in a neighborhood like that resort to selling drugs? Specifically when we find out his mom is on drugs, why would he do the same thing to someone else's mother that someone's doing to his mother, you know? Why? What would put him in that predicament? What kind of desperation would force him to do that? And so I wanted to do that because if nothing else, I wanted to humanize this young boy and hopefully humanize these young men who end up in these situations. I will never condone what they do, but I want to explain the why and the mindset and what forces them to do that, and then how it is in a community like that, how there are so few opportunities to better themselves or provide for their families that they feel like this is the only way. So is somebody going to change that? That's the ultimate question. So with Khalil, it would have been easy for people to, if he was a real young man, to say, oh, that's just a drug dealer who lost his life. There's nobody to cry over. But I want to show you why he got in that position, where this young boy's heart really truly laid, and hopefully it'll make you look at the real Khalils and say, maybe I need to look at the whys instead of the what.
Yeah, I think that you did a really good job of illustrating to younger readers what the illusion of choice looks like in that situation, particularly when you grow up in poverty. And that is sort of like juxtaposed with the fact that when Maverick wants to help a young guy out, he puts him in the shop.
Yes.
So it's like there are really two ways of earning money.
Yeah.
You know, you deal drugs or you work in Maverick's shop, and he can only have so many members of staff.
Yeah.
I noticed he employs his own children. That's probably to cut back back on costs. You know?
Yeah.
And
he's cheap.
But I thought that was, you know, really interesting because it wasn't like a Saturday job was going to be forthcoming for Khalil.
Right.
And I hope that that's, you know, younger readers think to themselves, you know, it's not just as simple as I've decided I want to be a bad person today.
Right,
you know?
exactly. It's never that simple. You know, you go, if you ever go to a prison and ask some of those people there, how did you end up here? You'd be surprised at how they ended up there, how they ended up in these situations. We so often judge people by the mistakes they make, and we don't humanize them. And that's really what we have to do more of. So, Khalil and even Devontae in the book, I want to show why these young men ended up in these situations. Why did Devontae end up in a gang? Because he needed a sense of family. That's really what it came down to. Why do so many young people end up in gangs? Because they want that sense of family. So if we look at it from that point of view, maybe someone who's so far removed from that life will maybe understand it a little more. Maybe it'll encourage them to do something to change things.
Absolutely. It was really like heartwarming for me to sort of find out that The Hate U Give was made possible due to a grant from the non-profit We Need Diverse Books. Can you talk a little bit about the grant that you received? That was in 2015.
Yes. The Walter Dean Myers grant. Walter Dean Myers was a phenomenal Black author in the States of young adult literature. And he passed, I think around the time We Need Diverse Books was first established, and so they named the grant in honor of him, and they gave it to new unpublished authors whose work they felt deserved the merit. And I remember I applied for it and I forgot about it, and then I ended up getting a literary agent, and like a month or two after I signed with my agent, I got an email, congrats, you won the grant. You know, We Need Diverse Books is doing amazing work, especially in the States, in diversifying children's literature, and not just the authors and the books, but even diversifying publishing. They have grants for interns. They have all of these things so that we can have more diverse gatekeepers. So with this grant, though, specifically, it was for those emerging voices to hopefully give them a little leg up. Because let's be real, when you're a writer, money is still a thing. You know?
I mean, it's hard to eke out a living when you're emerging, for sure.
Yes.
So you used the money to buy a new computer?
Yes. My the computer I had at the time was literally held together by tape. Like the screen was held together by tape. Yes. And like some of the keys were off, and like my mom would look at my keyboard and she's like, "Where's the K?" And I'm like, "It's right there, I swear." So it was I have to use like the on-screen keyboard and all of that. So when I got the grant, I was able to buy a new laptop, which was good because like a week after I bought the laptop, the other one died and I would have lost the whole book.
You're stressing me out.
Thank you, We Need Diverse Books.
Just the idea of that stresses me so much.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask because Lionel Shriver, somebody who's never seems to have to code switch.
No.
Recently attacked Penguin Random House's diversity strategy. Basically, they've said we want to reflect Britain's population in our publishing house by 2025, I believe it is. She wrote in The Spectator, if an agent submits a manuscript written by a gay transgender Caribbean who dropped out of school at 7 and powers around town on a mobility scooter, it will be published, whether or not said manuscript is an incoherent, tedious, meandering, an insensible pile of mixed paper recycling. And I suppose, given the fact that you've written a phenomenally successful book, thanks to a grant from an organisation focused on finding authors who are not white, middle-aged, middle-class men or women in Lionel's case. What you made of that? What you made of that statement?
You know, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I have a lot of thoughts on her. One, the idea, basically what she's saying here and what it comes off to me and to other diverse authors is you're saying that our works are not good. We're only getting in there because of who we are. But it's as if she's saying we're not good enough to have a seat at the table. We're just being given charitable seats at the table, you know? And there are so many authors from diverse backgrounds who could write circles around her. So one, ma'am, you can stop. Two, this is coming from a person who is clearly threatened. For you to make a statement about that, that means you feel as if your seat at the table is threatened. That means that you feel as if this person is going to come take my place. That comes from a place of fear. But you know what? Maybe you should be afraid.
Yes.
Maybe you should be afraid. Yes, maybe you should be afraid. So it's ignorance, and it comes from fear. It really does. And in some ways, I almost feel sad for her that you would have to say something like that to make yourself feel better. That's just really what that comes down to. So but the fact is too, she's not the only person who thinks like that. There are a lot of people who are thinking like that, especially as we see initiatives to bring diversity into publishing amp up. We're seeing more pushback too. And it's from people who have been comfortable. But here's the thing, what's so different from let's say someone was given a deal just because they're Black or trans or whatever they
Caribbean,
may be. Yes. Let's say they were. Let's say they were. What makes that so different than when a white man is given a job position simply because his father knows this person? This is how our society has been operating for decades. Just because now that kind of idea may be being used towards a marginalized person, you have a problem with it. Where were you, Lionel, when this was happening with white men getting jobs based on who they know?
Yes, Lionel.
Exactly. So if you weren't saying something then, you can be quiet now.
I thought what was interesting is that I was recently at the British Book Awards. It was great to see the Hate You Give win an award.
Yes.
Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race also won an award. And
congratulations.
Congratulations to us both.
Yes.
High five.
Yes. Take that, Lionel.
I couldn't take 2 steps without walking through the venue and tripping over a gay transgender Caribbean who dropped out of school at 7 and powers around on a mobility scooter. The whole place was just full of them.
I know, right?
And I was like, wow, diversity has gone too far. Where are all the white people? The white middle-aged men? It's ridiculous. It's terrible. That's what I thought to myself. Anyway. Let's
God, that's hilarious.
The truth is, I want to hear from those authors. I personally like veer away from white male authors. It's controversial.
Yeah.
But it's a statement. Also, I'm not sent those books, so there's that. So I want to ask a question about the end. This is again a little bit spoilery. So if you've not read it, you're about to find out what happens.
You probably shouldn't have been watching this interview to begin with. It's okay.
So I'm sure you've seen Get Out. I listened to an interview with Jordan Peele, and he said that he changed the ending of Get Out. You know, the bit where the cops pull up after he's been beaten and battered, and he's had an awful time. Yeah. And there was an alternative ending. Yeah, I heard about that. Yes, in which he would have been arrested. And Jordan Peele said that he changed that ending because the circumstances of the world around had changed, and suddenly conversations about racism were not so much in the margins, etc., etc. But I think you've been braver than Jordan Peele in this instance, in that you've given a far more realistic ending to this story, which is that 115 isn't charged for the murder of Khalil. And I suppose with the book being a work of fiction, you could have easily put, he was charged and everyone was happy and justice was finally served. So first off, why? And secondly, if the optimism isn't found in the officer being charged, where does the optimism lie for you in the book?
Oh, yeah. Well, there are two reasons why. One, the big why was I spoke to a lot of attorneys. I spoke to a district attorney, people who deal with cases like this, and I presented it to them as if it was a real case. And they all said the same thing, he would get away with it. Every single one. It was heartbreaking for me because part of me hoped that maybe I could, give this a happy ending, but they said no, he would get away with it. So that's like the main why. But the big why actually deals with the second part of your question. I decided not to give a so-called happy ending because we don't see happy endings. I can barely count on one hand how many times I've seen a case like this end with actual justice. We don't see that in the real world. It almost feels like a fairy tale at times for something like that to happen. So how do we find hope in the midst of that? Starr's hope and my hope and the optimism is from her deciding to say, I won't be quiet, I won't give up. And I hope that young people, when they see things like this actually happen in real life, when they see another young black person lose their life and not receive justice, I hope that they decide not to give up, not to be quiet, to keep going. We romanticize the civil rights movement a lot. And one of the unfortunate things we do when we romanticize it is we look at it as being a short-term thing. This is not something that took place over the span of 5 years. We're talking at least 20, not more. It was a long time. The work that they did took a lot. So the work that we're doing now is going to take a lot. It's not going to change overnight, but it's going to take people deciding not to give up, not to be quiet. That's the optimism.
Absolutely. Okay, so I've got some questions from our shared shelf members.
Okay.
That I've chosen.
Okay.
With my own hand. Some from Instagram and some from Goodreads, and I'm also going to shout out the people who asked them because everyone likes to shout out.
Awesome.
Here's one from Goodreads that I thought was a really nice question. It's from Carrie. She says, I love the reality of complicated family relationships, like Seven's half-siblings and Uncle Carlos. It felt real. Where did you find the inspiration to include this dynamic in the hate you give, and what do you hope readers take away from this?
Are you trying to get in my business and find out about my family? I'm joking.
Carrie, you've overstepped the mark.
No, it's okay. It's totally cool. That was inspired not so much by my family, but by a lot of families that I know. Nowadays, what is a normal family? Have siblings, step parents, uncles and aunts who are like parents. That's normal. So why not show that in this book? And what I really wanted to show is that's a normal. Here's the thing too, it's not abnormal as long as there's love there. Every single person in Starr's life that she considers family, she knows that they love her. Uncle Carlos is a father figure to her. He loves her. So there's nothing wrong with having multiple father figures. But there's nothing wrong with her father being active and involved in her life too, because we don't see that a lot in media with black men. And so for her not just to have one dad, but two, it felt for me, if nothing else, I hope to combat that stereotype a little bit. But her having this, specifically, more so than Starr, but for Seven to have this abnormal family. He's got his dad, his mom, his stepmom, and technically stepdad, with King. How does he navigate all that? And I wanted to show, too, this young man whose family, in some ways, the setup is so dysfunctional, but he's so functional himself.
Absolutely. He's like the moral arbiter, particularly of that situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for me, it was paying homage to the families that I see who are making it work for the sake of the kids.
I also like the fact that, in that particular situation, when it comes to towards the end of the book, the party, and he has a go at his mum. You don't just end it there and it's like, cathartic, he's had a go at his mum and everything's fine. he has to come that like
Yeah.
he has to come back around with another conversation with her later on in the book, and she's annoyed with him.
Yeah.
And it's like you can't just walk away from that sort of confrontation.
No, you can't walk away from a black mama. I mean,
No. On Instagram, Rebecca.Fegali asks, which character, if any, did you sympathise with most when writing? When reading, it was Aisha for me. I was fascinated by her.
Oh, wow. I will say, too, if you're an Aisha fan, be on the lookout for the movie. Like, the actress who plays her does a phenomenal job with that character. So that's a little plug. But for me, I think I sympathize the most with Seven. I identify more with Seven than anybody. I'm a perfectionist like Seven. I am very protective of my family like Seven. I take on more than I should like Seven. And so I sympathize with him because here's this young man who wants to make sure everybody is right, even if that means he's not. Mm-hmm. And I get that so much. He takes on the weight of the world at times, even though his dad and his stepmom tell him, you can just be a kid. You don't have to do this. You don't have to take all this on. That was me as a kid. So I definitely sympathize with him the most.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Seven's character reminds me of what people working in mental health call the parentified child, mm-hmm. where he feels like he has to take on responsibility. And it's really, I think, important for young readers to read that bit at the end of the book where he's told, you're the kid, you know? And if the people around you are not looking after themselves, particularly the adult, you have to accept that.
Exactly,
you know?
Exactly.
And you can't save them.
Exactly.
But also I love that bit, now I'm doing spoilers, towards the end of the book where we learn a new side of Aisha. Mm-hmm. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. That was important for me to do because I know Aishas, and so often they're written off and they're just seen in one light when there's so much more to them. So.
Absolutely. On Instagram, AdventureGirl_Grey asks, is there a significance to why Starr has 2 R's in her name?
No.
No? Okay.
Okay, I will say though, the name Starr came from Tupac. He once said that if he had a daughter, he would name her Starr, specifically with 2 R's.
Okay.
And
so we have to ask him, and we can't do that.
No, but
right.
I think part of me thinks it came from Starry Night by Van Gogh. Okay. That was his favorite painting, and he was also inspired by the song Vincent, which was inspired by that. So I think it came from that whole Starry Night thing. So I think that's where the extra R would come from him. But for me, it has no meaning. I'm sorry, it's not an acronym too.
Sorry, AdventureGirl_Grey. Well, I thought it was an interesting question. Okay, so you've already touched on this a little bit, but Kate from Goodreads asks, can you please give us some background anecdotes about some of the challenges/obstacles or interesting moments you encountered while writing or researching your book?
Mm-hmm. I did a lot of research for this book. Like I said earlier, I spoke to legal experts, but then I also had to read court transcripts. I read everything from the Michael Brown case. I read Trayvon Martin's autopsy report. Stuff like that, that was difficult. Because especially when you're reading an autopsy report, they're so scientific. They didn't humanize him in that. And you're reading about how this bullet went this place. And it wasn't anything I needed to know, but I wanted to know as I wrote this book so that I could approach this with as much care as possible. Because even though they approached it in a scientific way, it made Trayvon that much more real to me. I never met him, never knew him. But even while reading that, I mourned for him even more. I mourned for what happened to his body in those moments. I mourned for that boy like I knew him even more than I initially did. So I read all of that stuff. I talked to cops. People are probably surprised to hear this, but I talked to cops. I have law enforcement in my family. And I specifically talked to Black cops, because so often they're left out of the conversation when it comes to police brutality. We don't talk about how for so many of them, the issue is, well, when I'm inside of the uniform, some people see me as a sellout. When I'm outside of the uniform, I'm still a suspect. You know, I was recently reading a gentleman on Twitter who's a cop who said he was at a call at a house at night looking around with a flashlight for bullet casings. And while he's on the call, they get a call from someone saying, there's a black man outside with a flashlight who looks suspicious.
People don't quit, do they?
And, and the 911 operator was telling them, and she was like, wait, never mind, it's you, ignore this. So we don't talk about what they go through too. So I talked to black cops, and I had to do a lot of research on PTSD because that's essentially what Starr suffers from. And one of my biggest regrets is that I didn't address that enough. We don't talk about mental health issues nearly enough, especially in the black community. And I wish I would have addressed it more. But it took a lot of research, a lot of crying. So when people tell me they cried while reading the book, I'm like, it's all good. I cried while writing it. We're even.
Absolutely. I think you're so right about PTSD because that's what I saw Starr's initial silence as,
Yes.
Shock.
Yeah.
Shock can steal your tongue from your mouth.
Yes.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
And the final question from Instagram is from All the Books Please. They ask, what were your favorite books in high school or books that impacted you at an early age?
The one book that impacted me the most was Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor. I remember the first time I read that book, I was in awe because it was the first time I read a book about a black girl in Mississippi, and there I was, a black girl in Mississippi. I was a huge Harry Potter fan, I think like most of the world.
Yeah.
But once I got to young adulthood, I didn't read a lot. I started to hate reading because I never saw books about people like me, rarely saw books about people like me. Like Twilight and The Hunger Games were the two big books, and I have nothing against either of those, but I just couldn't connect with them. I mean, my mom wouldn't have let me date a 300-year-old vampire. I don't care if he was sparkly,
Also, he was a bit possessive and abusive. There's
Exactly.
So your mom would have been
she would have whooped Edward's behind, like for real. She would have pushed him out into the sunlight and been done with that. So it's just, I didn't connect with a lot of books. So for me, my biggest influence was actually hip hop. I saw myself in that more than I saw myself in books. When Tupac was saying, give a holler to my sisters on welfare, Tupac cares if don't nobody else care, that was me. When Jay-Z was talking about Hard Knock Life, that was me. Now he talks about cheating on Beyonce, and I don't think anybody can connect with that.
No.
But
yeah, that's another thing that I sort of realized when listening to Tupac again. I was like, wow, like
he wouldn't have cheated on Beyonce.
Back in my day. No, it's just like some certain rappers are becoming ever divorced from reality.
Yeah.
Back in my day, it wasn't like that.
Tupac wouldn't have said slavery was a choice.
No, he wouldn't have.
But I think I need more rappers to actually take responsibility. I won't say that they did back then. Pac was a walking, talking contradiction. I will criticize him quicker than anybody. But when he did use his art for good, it was good. You look at a song like Changes or Keep Your Head Up or even Dear Mama, those songs had meaning. So I need more rappers to take that seriously. I look at Kendrick Lamar and I think he's doing amazing work. J. Cole, what Childish Gambino just did with This Is America is phenomenal. But like you said, but back in my day, there was a little more of it. Yes. So I need a little more of it.
Say back in my day, like we were adults.
I know.
So we weren't, but I also reading the book made me feel a little old because Star's 16 and she's like, oh yeah, old school hip hop, and I'm like, Tupac was literally just early 90s.
I know, but that's how the teenagers
To me, old school is 70s at least,
Yeah.
Even though hip hop didn't exist in its current form then, but
it's very sobering when I talk to teenagers and they're like, yeah, my dad listens to that, and I'm like, oh God.
Yeah. Are teenagers still using Tumblr?
Some of them, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they are. But a lot of them, I think, more so use like Snapchat and
the video.
Yeah, Musically and Instagram.
I don't know any of this.
I'm
old.
I'm old. I can't keep up.
Well, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.
It's been really interesting and really love the book. So, yeah, go read it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.